I'm going to be combining chapters 8 and 9 in this lecture, which is continuing with postmodernism specifically and looking at different thinkers, including critics of postmodernism. So, the kind of orienting question from me is, are we living in a new era? Because this was the claim that we've moved out of the modern era into the postmodern era, which is something completely new. And we hear these very exaggerated claims like we're at the end of history. And so this needs to be understood in a political context where I've touched on this already. We see, particularly in the United States and the UK, these extremely right wing governments coming into power and often breaking the power of civic groups like trade unions. And we see in those countries the left in a certain amount of disarray. This has changed somewhat. It's obviously society keeps changing, but part of and what was annoying about this attitude was it was very kind of prophetic, like this is just how it is and it's going to be like this forever, rather than seeing it as a historical movement. So we're going to look at some of the key thinkers and the key critics. We're going to start with Jean-Francois Lyotard, the French philosopher, and we're starting with him because he wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition in 1979 that brought that term into the mainstream discourse. It had existed before, but it became widely used. Now, a strange fact about this is it was written at the request of the Council of Universities of the Government of Quebec, and it was supposed to be on the state of knowledge in the contemporary world. So I suspect they were a bit surprised at what they received as a result of this request. So he was originally a Marxist and was disillusioned by the failure of the 1968 student and worker revolt in France. This is the backstory of many of these French intellectuals, like Foucault. A number of them were Marxists who became disillusioned. We also see in this period the fall of the Berlin Wall, and many people took that as the end of communism and socialism and the triumph of Western capitalism. So it was a period of a lot of disillusionment and disarray in the kind of left part of the spectrum. That has changed considerably. But he defines postmodernism as rejection of meta-narratives, so we already know that. I talked about that in the last lecture. But he includes in here the idea of science. So that was rarely being included in meta-narratives. They are more talking about religious narratives or literary canons, but here we have the idea of even questioning the idea of science as liberating, which is central to the whole modern rational idea of the world. And he also questioned the idea of progress narratives and communist revolution. So all of these idealistic utopian ideas that emerge out of the Enlightenment. And so you can see that deconstructionist energy in his work. So he, in this book, gets into the area of knowledge, as he was asked to do, but he basically argues, and this holds together a lot of different postmodernists, that there were no such thing as facts, only modes of discourse. So we can't make truth claims. So I think we can see very clearly in the period that we're living in how dangerous this is to say there's no such thing as facts, because then anybody can be right. They can say anything and it's right. It's just a matter of who's more convincing. So we can see the way the postmodernist thought is sort of chipping away at any ability to organize society, really, as I spoke about in the last lecture, which can only lead to cultural chaos, in my opinion. So he believed that knowledge is now a commodity. That's probably mostly right. So rather than it being truth or about facts, it's a commodity that's just bought and sold. He was concerned with the increasing power of computers, and he believed that this could it could go either way. And we talked about this in the section on McLuhan, that there's a global village, or is it a dystopian technocratic state? So he was definitely concerned with the ways in which computers could undermine human rights and human privacy. And he saw eclecticism as a hallmark of postmodernism. So in his opening story, The Postmodern Guy, man is trying to give a picture of what this would look like in a person. So he talks about This is true. There's something a little disturbing about the fact. So he said you can go into a strip mall and get food from anywhere. You can be eating Thai food in Japan. This is something we take for granted, a lot of us, at least if you're sort of have enough money to enjoy it, that this is very much a hallmark of I would say, from Gen X onward, that idea of constant travel, interested in other cultures. Now, obviously, there's nothing wrong with that, but he's saying that this kind of mixing and matching of different cultures is a hallmark because people don't have a sense of their own authentic culture. We're moving on now to look at the thought of Daniel Bell, who's American. Who started out as a journalist, kind of left-wing journalist, and he worked as a journalist on The New Leader and was labor editor for Fortune. He also worked in Paris in 1956 to 1957, and then he did his doctorate at Columbia and then worked at Harvard. So he was extremely concerned with political and economic institutions and the way they shaped the individual. So his books include Marxian Socialism in the United States, The End of Ideology on the Exhaustion of Political Ideas in the 1950s, and The Radical Right. So you can see he's part of that larger kind of disillusionment with certain forms of the left and leftist thought as a way of solving the problems of capitalism. And so he argued that we had moved into a new era, both economically and politically. And so that would logically then mean that you can't really apply Marx in the same way because the structure of society has changed. So he develops this idea that's extremely influential of the post-industrial information age, so that we've moved out of the industrial age into the post-industrial age. And so on page 265, Bell includes a chart, Bell's typology of types of society. And so, for instance, he divides it into main economic activity, pre-industrial, agriculture, mining, fishing, timber, industrial, manufacturing, post-industrial society, services. So you'll hear this all the time. People say we live in a service economy. So we've moved from actually making things to things like hospitality and hotels and restaurants and so on. So a consumer service society. Now, this didn't just happen magically. Many of you will be aware that various trade deals were made. This was part of the whole idea of globalization, which was, I remember it was touted as this miraculous movement that would make everybody democratic and make everybody wealthy. I'm exaggerating, but along that lines. And so we saw things like the NAFTA agreement between Canada and the US and Canada and Mexico. And what resulted, as many of you will know, is the complete hollowing out. I'll just use Ontario as an example, the complete hollowing out of manufacturing in Ontario. And so now looking back, many people were opposed to it at the time, but certainly now looking back, many people are saying this was the wrong move. But at the time it was presented as, I remember people saying, this is just the way it is, this is the way of the world, and it's good for everybody. So he talks about technology, pre-industrial, raw materials and muscle power, industrial society, energy, steam, coal, oil, gas, electricity, post-industrial society, information. Now, I'm going to get to Jameson, but I think we could already critique this. We're still using enormous amounts of gas and oil and all of these fuels. And the information age has not changed that. We still need huge amounts of power. They're saying now we need more power because of AI. I don't know if that's true. So there's a kind of illusion here that this is so different. But he's right, obviously. If we look at the jobs that people hold, the industrial sector has shrunk considerably. So now it's been shipped overseas. There still has to be somebody making things. So a lot of it, or most of it, has been shipped overseas, where there are no labor codes or fewer or less regulation. So the new order is typified by the dominance of the professional and technical classes, and the centrality of theoretical knowledge and technology. And here he's, of course, bang on. So sociologists like to do this to predict the future. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're right for a period of time. So here he's definitely correct that theoretical knowledge and knowledge of technology becomes one of the most prized aspects of society. And we have seen in our time period these techno barons have huge amounts of money and huge amounts of power. And we have certainly also seen in our time period that we shouldn't allow them to enter into politics. So I remember this very clearly, that Silicon Valley was going to save the world and technology was going to save the world. So this is another version of the kind of scientific meta-narrative of that technology is going to save us. This is often used when people talk about the climate crisis. Don't worry about it because technology is going to save us. I have not seen any evidence of that, but that's part of the rhetoric of this postmodern, post-industrial age. I want to look now at Manuel Castells, and it's very interesting to me the way that his bio is presented, depending on who's presenting it. So there's a whole politics of the biography. So they all agree he was born in 1942 in Spain, but that's where it often diverges. And so in the source I'm looking at, it says he actually got his PhD in France and was very involved in Marxist politics, including the 1968 uprising. And he was actually expelled from France. So that gives you some idea of how radical he was. And throughout his career, he's also worked for the Spanish government, for instance. And so he's one of those sociologists who's very interested in changing society for the better. He's very interested in public housing, making life better for people. And so he's also been a professor in the United States and other places around the world, including Spain. So he agreed with the idea that we live in a post-industrial age that he calls the information age, following on the agricultural and industrial ages. So he agrees with the other thinkers in that we've moved into a different time period. He believed that capitalism had been restructured and production and markets had been globalized. So this is part of this whole theory of globalization. And he also argued that globalization looks very different depending on what part of the world you're in. So if I'm in Bangladesh, globalization is going to look very different than it looks in Canada. And so for many people in Bangladesh, that means working in a sweatshop, receiving very low wages, and creating very cheap clothing for these companies, these fast fashion companies. So he argued that there's no longer a mass culture as discussed by Adorno and Marcuse, as media and audiences have fragmented. And so we all have experienced this, the way that even 20 years ago, people would be listening generally to the same radio stations, watching the same television programs, reading the same newspapers. This is not the case anymore. And some of you wrote about this in your last assignment, the way that we can get into these small groups on the internet that all have identical ideas. So it changes the whole kind of idea of the public and where we can discuss ideas. And it also, a number of you also talked about the way that this can lead to political polarization because you're not discussing these ideas as a group with people with differing ideas than yourself. So we often call it echo chambers, which we've seen also growing up as a result of the internet. So he also argued that this process accelerates disenchantment, so that idea coming out of Weber, that we're living in a bureaucratized, rationalized, disenchanted world. And so he said even religion is going online, and this is absolutely true, it is. Many religious groups are using YouTube. I think you could push back at this fairly easily, because as I showed in the clip that I've attached to Blackboard, we also see more and more young people going back to in-person versions of religion. So many religions use the internet to kind of introduce people to religion. I don't think it's necessarily a substitute, but anyway, that's he's right in the sense that we're seeing many things migrating to the internet. Now we come to Frederick Jameson, the American Marxist, who was a vocal critic of postmodern theory. When I came across his tome, Marxists love to write very long books, it seems, I heaved a sigh of relief, because he was highlighting what made me so uncomfortable about postmodern theory and postmodern thought. And so he believed that postmodernism was incorrect in its judgment that we were living in some kind of end of history, a different era. He believed it was just late capitalism. So still capitalism, just late capitalism. And I'm paraphrasing here, but modernism reveling in its own pathology. And I think this is brilliant. So it's the same, it's just exaggerated, and there's a few new tweaks. So he felt that postmodernism and its theories supported things like American military and economic dominance. It sort of dismantles the ability to even critique that. So if we can't even establish what facts are, or there's no truth, how do I say we shouldn't be going to war, going into these wars of empire? So he believed, as Mann calls it, it's a smog of ideology that stops us from seeing this as the same old, same old. In this case, it's the American empire going into places like Vietnam and Iraq, and now we're experiencing war in the Middle East. There were certain hallmarks of this late capitalism that are different. So he felt, if we look at page 285, that postmodernism, the postmodern period, what we've called the postmodern period, so late capitalism, has led to a new depthlessness in the art of film and other aesthetic products. So this idea of surface, and I'm going to be building this out with the next thinker, the idea that somehow nothing is quite real, we're just all on the surface. And so that's that story that Mann starts the chapter off with, is this person who's just sort of partaking of these eclectic things, and it's just nothing's very authentic, nothing feels very real about it. So he talks about the weakening of the sense of history. This one, for me, is really important and very dangerous. If we start to lose a sense of history, how do we analyze what's happening? How do we make sense of what's going on around us? Then we're just these consumers living in the endless here and now. So this is the other critique, that this contributes to consumer society, where you have no authentic identity outside of that, of buying and selling. A new technology connected to a new economic world system. So he definitely recognizes that with the rise of computers and the internet, things have obviously changed in that way. But he argues, and I think it's convincing, that it's still capitalism. It's still being used for it's full of advertising. It's YouTube has become like a television network largely. So a new political mission for art in the world space of multinational capital. So this idea of art and culture becoming a commodity, and also what he calls the waning of affect. So this is related to that idea of superficiality. No one is feeling anything anymore. It's this kind of bubble-wrapped existence, partly because we spend so much of our time in unreality online, and I'll be talking about that more in the next part of the lecture. We are going to end this lecture by looking at the work of Jean Baudrillard and then looking at pop culture, postmodern pop culture. And Mann clearly likes Baudrillard, so he's the whole desert of the real. And he spends a lot of time talking about pop culture. He's clearly somebody who loves film, which is interesting. So he, unsurprisingly, uses the film The Matrix, which is the great desert of the real. Any of you who have seen The Matrix know it's all about people who are living in complete unreality unless they take the proper pill that allows them to see reality. Here we go with this. He starts with being a Marxism, turns to structuralism and post-structuralism. He's also inspired by Marshall McLuhan, and he was very concerned with the impact of media and the internet on human psychology. And so we talked a little bit about this with Jameson, but that idea that somehow we're entering into the death of the real. And I think this is a really frightening and important concept. Is it getting to the point that we're so in the internet and in these virtual realities that we're not even paying attention to what's really happening around us? Now, I think current events have shown that that's not completely true, but I certainly see when Baudrillard was first writing how he might be concerned about this. And so it becomes kind of the opiate of the masses. We're just tuned out. We're just consuming stuff online, and we're not paying attention to politics and economics. or we're living within video games. So this maybe I'll ask a question about this on the discussion boards. Um, have we are we witnessing the death of the real or the desert of the real? So he comes up with the idea of the simulacra, and I'm going to turn to that now. Baudrillard develops this idea of the simulacra. Now, just to be clear, he develops this from the ideas of Plato. So Plato's idea of a false copy, but he takes it in a different direction. And so he believes that reality is being replaced by the simulacra. And so on page 290 of your textbook, Disneyland, Capital, and Hyperreality. So Baudrillard sees Disneyland as the perfect model of the nature of cultural simulation today. By an extraordinary coincidence, this deep-frozen infantile world was created by a man who is himself now in cryogenic sleep. Walt Disney himself, has only a simulated life to match the simulated social life found in his California creation of Disneyland, a third-order simulation of all of America. So some of you have taken my other classes will know I'll always have a go at Disneyland if I can do it. I remember when they started wanting to build Disneyland in France, and I just thought, really, are the French going to allow this? But I know Canadians love Disneyland, so we have to question our ideas in this course. So the idea of Disneyland is simulacra. I think it's very easy to argue for this. Just look at the castle, this fake castle that's been built. And then these creatures from all of their different versions of fairy tales and so on. And in my ritual and ceremonies course, I show a clip of Main Street USA where they're all dancing and singing down Main Street USA and all the different, their very sanitized version of all the fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm and so on, and the ways in which it's simulating a street, but it's not a street. It's basically in a big hot parking lot with professionals dancing around. And I contrast it with, for instance, the Good Friday Parade in Toronto at Easter, where it's just people from a church marching in the street, and people on the sidewalk sometimes get caught up in the parade, and it's part of a community effort. So this is the opposite of that. It's a simulacra of community and of America itself, but it's all completely false. Okay? And I've had, you're welcome to push back on this, but apparently there's such a thing as a Disney adult, and there's Disney cruises, and you can see the juggernaut that is Disney now. And it's there to make money. And a lot of Disneyland is just, selling the merchandise and so on. So it's taken up a lot of our cultural stories and narratives and myths and just turned it into a commodity that it's selling to people. It's interesting he uses the word infantile because I think this is one of the defenses of Disneyland, that everybody gets to be a child again and experience childlike wonder. So I'm just asking you to think about this. The argument seems pretty convincing to me that this is just pure simulacra, and it's a money-making endeavor. I couldn't move on from Disneyland without looking at the work of Banksy. Some of you will know the work of Banksy, and according to the internet, he was born in 1974. I don't know how they know that if we don't know who he is. He is anonymous, which is fascinating. I'm sure there's some people who know who he is, but I don't. I think part of his charm is we don't know who he is. So he started his career of just painting these murals on the sides of buildings that were highly political. Some of them are just beautiful. Some of them are very, very political. So, for instance, he's painted on walls in Gaza. So he's a very political artist. And in the beginning, the government in England, he's English, we know that, were very angry about his graffiti. But now Banksy's are worth a fortune. And that's the irony of art and how it gets taken up into capitalism. But I want to look at one of his more recent projects, which he calls Dismaland. And so he takes the idea of Disneyland and he parodies it. And so I could have used any of the images. I used this one. It's particularly horrifying. So you will know that part of the Disney franchise, it's all about the princesses and little girls dressing up as princesses and Cinderella and so on. And so he takes this, so he does this false kind of ride or whatever. And he, I don't know if you can see it here, but it's Cinderella's carriage is overturned. And then you see the paparazzi behind it. And it's clear that she's had an accident because of the paparazzi. And of course, he's alluding to Lady Diana, the death of Lady Diana here. And so you can see this is very grim. He's really undercutting the way this is presented, even just the idea of the princess and what does this mean in real life to be a princess. And so other exhibits were of, huge oil patches with animals dying in them. So he's cutting through that simulacra. He's cutting through the illusion using art. So I wanted to include this because I do think sometimes it's all, when you're doing kind of cultural critique, it's all very grim and it's as though nobody's pushing back, but there are always people that are pushing back, and Banksy has been one of the most successful at doing that. I want to end, as Mann does in your textbook, with postmodern pop culture on page 298, and he gives a good synopsis of all these chapters here, so this is a good way to kind of study it. And so he says, let's take a breath and review some of the main ideas found in the last 3 chapters to refresh our memories. So when we speak of postmodernism, we really mean 2 different things that are in part related. First, we have postmodern theory, a broad set of ideas that finds its origins in the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the early 20th century theorist Ferdinand de Saussure. And then the second sense of postmodernism is the idea that we live in a postmodern culture since roughly the middle of the 1960s. Okay, and so, most importantly for this section, he says, third, we live in a media-saturated and information-driven society. Radio, film, TV, and computers dominate our lives. As Marshall McLuhan pointed out, we now live in an electronic age dominated not by print-based media, but by electronic media that have turned the world into a global village. This has led to the mixing of the economy and popular culture as the realities created by the media get mixed up with the realities of everyday life. We can certainly see that with things like YouTube influencers. So he talks about the elements of postmodern pop culture. And so he talks about the coming of the hyper-real. So in postmodern culture, our social relationships are governed more and more by images and stories from mass media. The media no longer hold up a critical mirror to society, as the liberal theory of media suggests, but to a large degree make our society. I think he's overstating this here. Certainly, we've also seen the rise of these alternative news outlets on the internet that are definitely criticizing society. So I think that's an overstatement. The idea of the breakdown of high art. So in postmodern culture, high art becomes part of popular culture. So we can see that, just constant recopying of paintings by Van Gogh and so on. So art becomes a collection of products for sale in the marketplace. Now, art was, pretty much always for sale, but it's, I suppose, accelerated. The emphasis on surface over depth, style over substance. I think that's absolutely true, and we can see that in critiques of social media like Instagram. And I remember when Instagram first came out that I was a bit puzzled by it because my students were telling me that it was very bad for their mental health. And I said, well, why are these pretty pictures bad for mental health? But we now know that they are. And so we see the way that people present their lives in this very surface way. Again, we could bring Goffman in here. You're just seeing the front. You don't see the back part of their life where they're, arguing with their children and their house is a mess and so on. And so this very glossy surface. And it seems to do something to us when we see that. We're like, why don't I live in this perfect white home where everything is wonderful? And why can't I go on these amazing glossy vacations? So there's absolutely truth to that. And we talk about the idea that human beings compare themselves to others. It's just what we do. And so these forms like Instagram really cause a lot of social comparison. So I've given an image of The Simpsons here because it's probably sort of the show most associated with postmodern pop culture, and it's, as most of you will know, it's a parody. So they're making fun of all these different aspects of contemporary culture. It's obviously a very long running show. And so we also see, so if we go through this whole section in your textbook, they talk about recycling. So postmodern culture recycles the past, reusing old forms or stories in current content. This includes historical nostalgia films such as Titanic and Pearl Harbor. I think this has always been true. I don't know if that's really a new thing. Pastiche and double coding. So he gives the example of Blade Runner, which puts together film noir and science fiction. Fabulous film. But so you can read through this whole section of how pop culture differs from high art, for instance. So he talks about parody. Postmodern TV, film, and art often include parodies of a specific cultural object or genre at their core. The essence of the popular cartoon show The Simpsons is parody of just about everything: the family, politics, religion, TV, movies, and popular music. Each episode is rich in the sort of omni-parody many explode with pop cultural references. Okay, so this is a show that in its heyday, actually, people were talking about it all the time and quoting it. I have my own critique of it and the way it depicts, for instance, it's a whole documentary on Apu and how it depicts different religions. But certainly it has all the hallmarks of pop culture, including its humor and its lightness of touch. And so I will leave you to read through that section. I think he's overstating certain things about it, but there is no doubt that with all of this migrating onto the internet, that it has changed our culture, and some would even argue our psychology.